This is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulte. Welcome back to our show. I am very happy to have Peter Jussi back with us. Today, Peter Jussi is going to talk about something very, very important. China. China. Please, Peter.
Nice to meet you again.
It's a pleasure
wonderful.
having you back.
Well, with China, it's a big subject, but let's point out what are their goals? What are their objectives? My friend and colleague, Mike Pillsbury, who's at the Heritage Foundation, was at Hudson where we work together. He's written a book called The 100-Year Marathon. It's a couple years old, but it is so important that the Japanese translated it into Japanese and printed 10 million copies. The Indians thought it was so important, they translated it into Hindi and also, I believe, printed millions of copies. What he said is he found a document in China that talked about 100 years from the Chinese Communist Party taking over China in 1948. Mm-hmm. That in 100 years, China would be the preeminent world power. Now, I was at a conference in Omaha, Nebraska, at STRATCOM, stands for Strategic Command, a number of years ago, and I was speaking on China, and my panel colleague was from a School of International Affairs. I don't want to say who, I don't want to
It's okay.
criticize the individual by name, but the comment from the person was, oh, what are you worried about? America is McDonald's and China's Burger King. And they're just trying to make a better hamburger.
Hey, when you have so many people.
What's your problem? So that is the traditional view, is that, and we would like to help Burger King be prosperous. Well, you've heard it. We want China to be strong. We want China to be economically strong. And the assumption was the better they become economically, the more they'll develop a middle class that will moderate their China with communist characteristics. And yet, it's totally wrong, those assumptions. And Mike's book is about why, what we did and why we were wrong, and what China's ambition is, and what are they up to? Well, in 2009, I hosted the head of the National Security Agency, Keith Alexander, who was a 4-star general, at a dinner at the National Defense University in the library of the War College. And my guests were the CEOs of the 48 largest aerospace companies in America. And most of these companies actually were supportive of the work I was doing. And I asked General Alexander, I said, I'd like you to talk about the stealing of our proprietary information from our industry, not just the government, not the government, but just industry. And he had index cards, which he gave me, in which he told the assembled group of ladies and gentlemen that China was stealing $400 to $600 billion annually in intellectual property, which was the seed corn of productivity in American industry. Now, what does that mean for the average viewer out there? Well, if your productivity of your company goes up, you can pay your workers more money because they produce more per hour. But if that intellectual property is stolen and China has it in their technology, they get to produce more an hour.
And
they get the money.
Yes.
And you're stagnant, because without productivity increases, how can I raise my prices or sell more because I got a better product and give you more money as a worker? So China basically is stealing the wages of American workers on top of the millions of industrial manufacturing jobs that were moving to China. So that was number one. And what's fascinating is when General Alexander told them this, their faces became ashen. They didn't realize it, that they were being their whole effort to be more productive and more technologically advanced was being stolen by the Chinese right from out under them, because they were moving factories to China. They had a lot of Chinese citizens come work for them, because more Chinese citizens are here in American universities getting degrees in the hard sciences, physics, energy, than we are. Okay? And they know, because they're not getting a degree in transgender Hispanic studies. Okay? And thank you, Bill O'Reilly, for finding that out about a student down in, remember Occupy Wall Street? There was a young lady had a sign that says, I'm graduate from Harvard, I can't get a job. So he sent Jesse Walters down to find the young lady, found her, and Jesse said, well, on camera, said, well, what'd you major in? And she said, I majored in transgender Hispanic studies. And O'Reilly, of course, put that on and said, now do you understand why she can't find a job? Okay, we're doing transgender Hispanic studies, and the Chinese are doing engineering and physics. And
we're not making those people who are studying science important.
That's the major thing that became known in America about, oh my God, this is what China's doing. But then I went down to Florida, to Southern Command, and I thought we were going to have a briefing with 100 people. It turned out the briefing was just one-on-one. And the briefing was from an Air Force general, was a 3-star. And I knew him because he was a nuclear weapons guy formerly was in San Antonio, the Nuclear Weapons Center. And he said, Peter, it's going to be a 4-hour briefing of what China's up to in the Americas, from South America, Chile to Canada. Let's go through. Pretty simple. First thing they do is build a soccer stadium in a country. And everybody knows it's built by the Chinese. Then they give $1 billion worth of Chinese funding money to the country, saying you can buy any Chinese product you want up to $1 billion, free of charge. What's the catch? Well, we want control of your ports. We want to manage your ports. Okay. We then also want to manage your banks, and we'll show you how to keep money in your country and don't let people leave town with money. And we also want you to learn how to stay in power. You control information flows, meaning the internet and social media.
And we'll be able to show that too.
We'll teach you how to do a social score, meaning if you hang around with the bad people, you get a bad social score. If you aren't a member of the Communist Party, or in your case, do you demonstrate, write up tutorials, oppose the government? No. We give you a bad social score in China. And bad social score means you can't get credit. You can't get a good job. You can't get a nice apartment. You can't buy a car. In short, we control you through the internet and your activities. And governments that are dictatorially inclined, because they see this as a way of keeping power, grabbed onto this. Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Cuba. What did Cuba do? Oh, you can put your listening post in Cuba, which is where the Russians used to have listening to America, what's going on. So China did this all over Latin and Central America. And then in the Western Pacific, I was just reading yesterday, the Chinese are bribing, coercing through trade and economics, all the islands in the Pacific, including Palau, Solomon Islands, all the areas, Guam, not Guam because we own that, but areas that are owned by the Philippines and so forth. Remember in the 1930s something called the East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was the Japanese plan to build an empire all through the Western Pacific and Southeast Asia, which they did. Now, they lost the war, but China is doing exactly what they're trying to do. And they're using bribery, coercion, economic power, military power to do this from one country after another, after another, after another, all the way from Burma all the way to the Philippines. and in the Western Pacific. So if you control those island chains, you can
How do you counter
push
that?
you can push military power from them, and because you have military power going in all sorts of directions, not just from the Chinese mainland, you control the sea lanes. And the sea lanes are not only commerce, but also military traffic.
And you can refuel.
Well, you control the surface of where 90% of world trade is ocean-borne. Now, one area might be a little bit more, maybe a little less, but if you control that, you control world commerce. And that is what they want to do. Plus, they want to deny America access to that part of the world. So there's South America, Central America, and there's the West Pacific. Then they do something called belts and roads, or sometimes called belt and suspenders. And that is they go in and, as I said, with the soccer stadium and the banks and the IT, is they build infrastructure, but almost always with Chinese labor.
Which
They
stays there.
import Chinese labor. And they basically use economic coercion and bribery to coerce the governments of the place to sell them raw materials and then buy Chinese products. When you look at the world trade deal, China has a trade deficit with the world with the exception of one country, the United States. And there they have about a $690 billion surplus, which is where they get all the dollars with which to invest around the world, because most countries don't particularly accept Chinese funding money, except for, oh, here's some free money, you can go. Now, there are reports that are fairly standard that the Chinese are going bankrupt, some of this stuff, and the Chinese are losing 1 million plus people a year demographically, which hurts their ability to have workers for their factories. Their stock market lost $7 trillion, according to Gordon Chang, over the last 5 years, basically since COVID. And they have internal debt. The provinces owe the central government somewhere in the vicinity of, I've seen numbers as high as 60 trillion, not billion, trillion. So they have some very serious problems. But here's the problem. I see it. If you're sitting in China and you're going, America is modernizing its military, but it's going to take until 2030 and beyond to really make a difference. Because we're actually reducing our forces now to save money, because old forces cost a lot of money. And so we're getting rid of those, save money, put that in research and development to make better weapons. But it's going to take till the end of the decade and beyond. And China is saying America is going to be stronger then. So in the scheme of things, when is America going to be the weakest?
Now.
And they have an administration, unfortunately, that has a chief executive that, and I don't want to be partisan here, but now it's pretty well now understood. There's a problem. And the question then, between now and January 2025, we may or may not have a new chief executive, I don't know. But if you're Xi Jinping or you're Putin and their allies, Iran, Cuba, Nicaragua, North Korea, what kind of mischief do you get up to in the interim? And I have to be very candid. Who would you rather have sitting across the table from Xi Jinping? Kamala Harris or Donald Trump? You've seen the vice president and her word salad, which is incoherent. And I don't want to be partisan, but you got to understand the bad guys look at this and they calculate, is this the time to do something where we don't have to worry about the consequences, which gets to the whole point, as I'm a senior fellow at the National Institute of Deterrent Studies, which which I joined last August. They're an extraordinary organization, but they're one of the few in America that are devoted solely to preserving, sustaining, and improving deterrence. Because without deterrence, which is Victor Davis Hanson, the professor out at Hoover and at Stanford, says, unless there are consequences for doing bad things, bad guys will do bad things. And we've seen it. I mean, whether it's Afghanistan or whether it's Iran or the Houthis or Ukraine and or China, if you're not willing to stand up to them and deter them, then your deterrent, you're telling them, yeah, we may have the technology, but we're not willing to use it. Well, zero will times 100% technology is
zero.
Still exactly is zero. And everybody, your entire listening audience and watching this, that's not a partisan statement. It is why if you lose deterrence, you have lost. And I go back to something I hadn't read before. I'd seen it, but I hadn't read. President Reagan in 1985, after his famous speech at Normandy called The Boys of Pointe-du-Hoc, if you remember, gave another speech in 1985, a year later, about Normandy, because of the anniversary. I think it was the 41st or something. I can't remember what the number is. But he said, the reason you had to fight Normandy was your national leaders, and he's talking to soldiers, retired mainly, but the reason you have to fight at Normandy is your national leaders forgot to sustain deterrence. They stood down when they should not have stood down. And once they stood down, the bad guys said, in this case, of course, it was Hitler, Mussolini, and Tojo, and they did bad things. And you can say, oh, it's not worth stopping them. Well, I don't think that's the case in World War II. I don't think that should have been the case in Korea. And the thing is, you can't determine beforehand what the bad guys are going to do. So to give them a kind of a carte blanche, oh, well, we don't care what Russia does, or we don't care what North Korea does, or we don't care what Iran does. Once you say that, you put them in the catbird seat. They get to decide what to do. And then you're stuck because you don't know what they're going to do. They may go into Bolivia. They may go into Kazakhstan. I mean, who knows? But if you can't be prepared because they then have carte blanche about, well, I think I'll just go after the weakest. Now, we call it, some of us folks call it the Serengeti complex. If it's wounded, it dies. Okay? If there's a gazelle or a wildebeest or an antelope flopping around and is injured, guess what? They're toast. That's the law of the jungle. But I wrote an op-ed called The Law of the Jungle, which I said, this is what Mr. Putin believes in. Unfortunately, it's also what Xi Jinping believes in, and Kim Jong-un and the mullahs in Iran.
It doesn't take much imagination to understand that.
No, and I think your viewing audience, irrespective of your politics, you want America to be safe. And go back to what I do for a living, is I can't determine what the threats are. They're there. And my job is to help my clients, whether the military or the industry or the general public, is every week I do a report on nuclear weapons stuff about what's going on with the bad guys. I call them the Brothers Mayhem: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. Then I talk about what is Capitol Hill doing, what's the administration doing, what are the quotes of the week, what are the events you should look at. And I write an essay every week about some aspect of nuclear stuff. And then I put in my report some essays by some of my colleagues and friends that I think are particularly good. And then I do an archival, go back in history, which is, I have a speech by General Hyten, who was the Strat commander in Omaha, which is our top nuclear commander in the military. He worked for, of course, the president. But then also he was vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And he also was co-chair was on the strategic Posture Commission, which issued its report last October, and their number one finding was Russia and China, in particular, think of nuclear weapons not to deter the United States from doing bad things,
Right.
which is how we look at it when we're trying to stop them. Totally different. They've turned it totally on their head. And that is when they commit conventional aggression, like Putin did in Ukraine, he sees nuclear weapons to stop us from coming to the defense of our friends. The Posture Commission said it's called nuclear weapons as instruments of bullying and coercion. Very smart. Well, it's typical. It is very well known in military circles. Is what they're trying to do is you're not coming to the defense of your friends because our nuclear weapons service aggression. They don't stop it. They stop you from coming to the defense, but enable us to commit aggression. That completely flips deterrence on its head.
And if you decide to come against us, we'll loosen our nuclear weapons on you.
Well, in the theater. Because the idea is, yes, if we hit New York, you're going to hit Moscow. Mm-hmm. And that's suicidal. But you only have 200 gravity bombs in Europe on fighter planes, and you have none in the Pacific. So in the theater, we, Russia, have at least 1,900. That's what our intelligence community thinks. And China, pick a number, because they're not transparent. They don't publish their statistics.
As much as they can produce.
So you have a problem of, in the theater, using in Ukraine or in the environment around Ukraine, what if they hit 4 or 5 U.S. air bases in Europe?
One time.
Just take out the ability from them to fly airplanes. Now, we're not using American airplanes to go after Russia. But what happens if they go after Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, go after Poland, if they took over Ukraine, but they can go after the Baltics, even not taking over Ukraine. And you are basically rolling the dice that, well, maybe he won't. And that's the problem. This is, if you believe in your deterrent, then you say, no, Mr. Putin, you ain't going any further. You're not going into Ukraine, period. And we're going to fight you. Because we believe our deterrent is strong enough, you're not going to go nuclear. But when you say over and over again, I'm worried about escalation, that Mr. Putin may use nuclear weapons, what did you just tell Mr. Putin? Your nuclear weapons are deterring us from coming to the defense of Ukraine. So all we can do is give Ukraine weapons. But sometimes we say, well, don't use those weapons to go after Russia proper. You can only fight Russians in Ukraine. And then we said, well, if the Russians are launching weapons from Russia, you can go after those areas, but not anything else. Because why? We're worried about escalation. Same thing in Iran and the Persian Gulf, and as we don't want to go after Iran's navy or their military. So even though they attacked America 170 times between October, when Hamas went into Israel, to January 24, they attacked America 170 times. Did we go after Iran? Any territory of Iran? Any navy? Any army? Well, Israel did. But they attacked Israel with, when you add in Hamas and Hezbollah, thousands of ballistic missiles and rockets. And when you look at that, ask yourself, has deterrence broken down? And I have to tell you, the answer is, unfortunately, yes. So the issue is, how to rebuild it?
How do we do what?
Rebuild deterrence.
What do we do between now and January 2025?
Pass a defense bill, as opposed to a continuing resolution. Make sure that defense bill is chock full of what it should be. I know there's a budget ceiling deal that is still in existence. Only a 1% growth is allowed, but we have to undo that. But we also have to stick to reducing spending elsewhere. Just because defense needs to go up doesn't mean everything else has to go up, which is what the people who oppose defense say. Well, if defense gets this, we get this. What do you mean we? This is your country, for crying out loud. If we need more defense, then why should we then be profligate everywhere else when the defense is very determined by what's the threat? And if you don't believe the threat is there, well, let's have the debate on the floor of the House and the Senate. Tell me why there's not a threat. Because if there is, and you're not willing to spend the money, that means you're willing to risk deterrence again. You're willing to weaken deterrence, which tells the bad guys what? You're not willing to stand up for what you have said is necessary to stop. And if you're not willing to do that, is what, remember what we did in January 1950, we said, South Korea is beyond our perimeter. And what happened in June? North Korea invaded the South, and I lived in South Korea for a couple of years as a student. We lost 3.5 million Koreans died, plus 38,000 American soldiers. There are real consequences for being stupid. I mean, there just are. This is a real world, and that the Chinese and the bad guys out there are serious.
And they will certainly make sure that they have the resources, natural resources that they need for their people.
Yes,
and
we
they
have
will
to
deprive us of
we have to, as they say, grow up. And there are people in Congress that are grown-ups, and there are people who are in America. Victor Davis Hanson is number one in my book, but then the General Heitens and the former Senator Kyle and Admiral Richard, who is a former strat commander, General Anthony Cotton, who's our current strat commander.
What do you recommend that my audience do?
Make sure the defense bill is passed by September 30th and that it has the necessary add-ons that the Senate has put in and which the Posture Commission said we should do. And that is the best thing they could do, is go to Washington and pound on people's doors.
At least call your senators or email your senators to ask them to pass that defense bill.
But do it on time. In the last 47 years, we have passed a defense bill 3 times on time. Now, I would say a lot of those years we finally passed it in 6 months.
Peter, I want to thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been
It's always a pleasure
to have you back on the show.
Thank you.
This is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulte. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day. Goodbye.